Today on FDA TV, I would like to welcome Dr. Maria Victor. Dr. Victor, based out of Toronto, Canada, is a founding member of the Canadian Bolivarian Circle, has a PhD in sociology from York University, and is an outspoken Venezuelan expatriate on Chavez Venezuelan democracy. Before we begin discussing the linkage between Simon Bolivar and the Chavez government, would you please tell me and the FDA viewers why you are so outspoken on Venezuelan democracy and why you may be coined pro-Chavez?
What I experienced personally was a complete dissonance. Knowing Venezuela as I do, I was born there. My first university degree was from there. I visit the country every year to visit my family. And then to be reading here in Canada the most outrageous articles and distortions about what was going on in the country. I have never been a political person, but I just thought, this can't be continue. Someone has to tell the Canadian public that what the mainstream media was saying about Venezuela, and particularly about President Chavez, was quite frankly untrue or highly exaggerated. So I felt a sort of a personal, I would say, mission to be a sort of a bridge between Canada and Venezuela, because really there was great ignorance in Canada about Venezuela. First of all, Canadians don't usually read or study about Latin America or Venezuela in school. That is something important, that they don't know the history. And second of all, and this is quite an indictment of Canadian media, that the main newspapers and television stations here have no regular reporter, journalist stationed in Venezuela or Latin America. A few of them go back and forth now and again. One main newspaper here said, oh yes, they did have someone, but he was stationed in Washington. Now this is ridiculous. And most of them don't speak Spanish. So there was a vacuum in Canada as to what was actually happening in Venezuela, or at least that they would get some sort of information that was not biased so that Canadians could make up their own mind. But if Canadians are receiving information from Latin America, and specifically from Venezuela, that is filtered through the eyes of the American big media companies, then we don't have a Canadian vision of Latin America. Then we don't have a Canadian position with respect to Venezuela or any of the countries, because we're receiving it all through CNN, or we're receiving it all through Reuters or United Press or all of these. So that's what made me personally say, well, I must step out of my home, I must step out of my classroom, and I must speak out as to what is happening in Venezuela. That answers your question.
Are you doing any academic work on this topic or related to it?
I am retired from academia, but I write many articles that get published, some in Canada and some in Latin America.
How often in the last 10 years have you gone to Venezuela?
Oh, every year.
Every year. Another thing I'm wondering too is, do you have any ties to any organizations in Venezuela, or are you independent, or?
Well, I have ties to the Louis Riel Bolivarian Circle here in Toronto, which is a recognized, we have been trying to tell Canadians about Venezuela for the last 8 years. But we are independent in the sense that President Chavez certainly doesn't know that I'm here. No, we don't have any link to any government, either Venezuela or Canada. We are independent.
Just before we get into the topic, the Canadian Bolivarian Circle, how has that developed in your eyes? Has it met your expectations? Are you having any impact in the Canadian media? Because it's so controlled by the large corporations, it seems like it would be a real struggle for you to really get your message out.
It is a struggle, but our message has certainly been easier to take to the Latin American groups in Canada. So we are very connected to a series of Latin American groups that discuss and are interested in what is happening in Latin America in general and Venezuela specifically. But I will tell you that one thing that I did, which was good, was that we presented, I guess, what is a sort of a demand to the Ontario Press Council, and we objected to four articles of the Toronto Star filled with absolute untruths that were published in May about 3 years ago, and we presented our complaint to the Ontario Press Council, which was a very involved process. It was almost like going to court, and I am happy to say that we won. And I think it was the first time that the Ontario Press Council accepted not just a mild correction over one article, but rapped the Toronto Star on its knuckles for having published four highly dubious articles in which they just simply criticized the Venezuelan government in all sorts of instances, and never once interviewed anyone that was related to the government. So that is against the principles of fair play and replica and all of this that they have. So we were able to do that, and since that time, I believe certainly the word got out that there is a group of people here who are reading very carefully what is written about Venezuela, and we won't accept such overt, I would say, slagging of the country and its process of I would say, its second independence.
Turning now to Simon Bolivar, who was obviously a great liberator of Latin America. We're wondering, what is the linkage between Simon Bolivar and President Chavez and his government in the current state of Latin America and Venezuela itself? Is there a linkage?
Oh, absolutely, quite directly. You know, Simón Bolívar wasn't just a brilliant military strategist and military leader. He was also a brilliant leader of government and of the people. He was the one who gave an ideology to the War of Independence. He was a man who was brought up with all the ideals of the Enlightenment. So he believed firmly in the French Revolution's human rights of man, as they called it then, human rights. And he believed firmly in republicanism, not on monarchy. And what was happening in Latin America was that Latin America was kept in a state of, as Simón Bolívar said, of childishness, because people who were born in Latin America were not able to have any position in the governing of Latin America or in any serious position in the military, because they didn't allow military there. So he's the one who brought the ideology forward and said, look, there are two very important things that he said. One is the Latin American nations that are coming up need to be united. They need to be integrated. Even though they may have their own governments, if they are not together, they will fall prey to the next empire, which will be the United States. And he says this quite clearly. Mm-hmm. So he is a great advocate of union. He anticipated not only the Organization of American States, but indeed the United Nations. He said, wouldn't it be wonderful if the Isthmus of Panama would be the seat of a new integration of the Latin American countries in which they could speak to the European powers. So he even said, wouldn't this be good even for Europe, that they would be united in something like this? So he's even anticipating the European Union. Now, he said this 200 years ago. Mm-hmm. The second thing that was, and so this is very important because this is the foundation of the foreign policy of President Chavez and his government. That is that Venezuela is not alone. That Venezuela, if it wants to be free, if it wants to be independent, if it wants to be able to feed its people, it must do so in conjunction with its neighboring countries. So that, and that isn't just, oh, we are all brothers and sisters kind of sentimentalism. This is a policy that was concerted. And what they did was they tried to create the infrastructure so that the Latin American countries could integrate, respecting each other's sovereignty. So the first thing was Telesur. Telesur is the television of the South, where the countries can find out what's happening to each other directly, because all the state TVs are united. Before Telesur was created, the way that Latin Americans had of knowing, for example, what's happening in Patagonia, what's happening in Argentina, what's happening in Brazil, was through CNN in Espanol, which I'm sure you would realize was a tremendous distortion. Mm-hmm. Then there is the Radio del Sur, which is the radio of the South, which has the same function. Then there was Mercosur. The first thing about Mercosur, which Venezuela really urged to change, was that it shouldn't just be a commercial, free trade. It shouldn't be based on the free trade principles. It should be based on the fact that we should do commerce together and we should try to help each other. Then there was ALBA. The ALBA is a union of, right now there's about 8 or 9 countries. And what they do is that we must help each other to solve the problem of poverty. And to do that, we're going to exchange products one with the other and exchange services and exchange, this is very important, expertise. So the ALBA is a great example alternative to free trade, because the object is not to further the companies of one country or the other, but to actually solve the social problems of each country. So, as I think I mentioned before, Nicaragua, who knows a great deal about cattle, is helping Venezuela with its cattle. And Venezuela is helping some other countries with all its petroleum. So then there is the Banco del Sur and the Banco del Alba, which meant that the Latin American nations don't have to go and kneel like beggars before the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to beg for loans, because the countries put their money together and then they lend each other money for their development without telling the countries what they should do in other aspects of their policy. In other words, with no strings attached and no enormous usury in terms of interest. So all this was the foundation of what Bolivar said. Unless you are united, you will be prey to the next empire. The second most important thing that Simón Bolívar said, which was central to the Bolivarian Revolution, to President Chávez's ideology and his government, is that Simón Bolívar, at that time it was called liberalism, he believed in the rights of man and all of this, but he also believed that the state had a duty to try to provide the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Now, what this does is it anticipates by 200 years the welfare state. Because what it says is that the government isn't simply sitting there, doing one or two things. It has to actively try and make its people happy. Now, what was he talking about at that time? He was talking about a subcontinent that was full of people who had been oppressed by the most horrendous colonialism, that had been oppressed by slavery, where the grand majority of Latin Americans were illiterate. So he said, people cannot be free unless you lift them out of this misery, unless you have education. He would always say something like this. He said, moral y luces. He said, the two things that you need to be free is morality, which means, morals, values that would lead people towards good things, and luces. Luces means light that comes from education. So he is saying, and this is central to the government of President Chávez, government must try to eradicate poverty. The state must try to give people education. And this is very important. The third thing that was very important for Chávez that comes from Bolivar is Bolivar tried 3 times to liberate the continent from the Spaniards. The first 2 republics failed, and Bolivar recognized why they failed. There were many other reasons, but one of the central reasons was that those 2 attempts for the first and second republic were done by an elite of enlightened criollos. These were men who were born in Latin America. They belonged to elite. They were very intelligent. They were very educated. They believed in the French Revolution, the rights of men, but they were acting alone. They didn't include the people. And what Bolivar said, we cannot be free unless we are also going to give freedom to the slaves. We're going to give freedom to all the in-between people who are called pardos, so that they can be participants of the government, so that they can take part in this quest for independence. Because unless the people see independence as something that is going to be for them too, they will not follow us. So in the third attempt, of course, he was successful, because most of the bulk of the army of Simón Bolívar were those pardos, those people who were mixed races, and thousands of indigenous peoples who went out to fight with their bows and arrows and their lances. And of course they were the majority, and of course they were triumphant. So these were the 3 important things. That there were many more, but I would consider these are the 3 important ideology of Simón Bolívar that we see present right now in the ideology of President Chávez's government. 1, the integration of Latin America, respecting each country's own culture and each country's own sovereignty, and yet united in solidarity so that they can try to bring their countries out of misery, out of poverty, out of lack of education, bring them towards a type of development that will not harm the environment, because like President Chávez says, what we are seeing right now is a savage capitalism. And so this is something that's very important. The second thing is, what is the role of the state? The role of the state isn't just to facilitate private concerns, facilitate corporations, help some people get rich. The function of the state is to try to make the most of their people, as many as they can, happy by bringing them out of this misery. And as I said, the third thing is that he is anticipating this idea of unity of the nations. I saw this just 2 days ago when the foreign minister of Venezuela, Mr. Maduro, went before the Human Rights Office in Geneva that had brought out an absolutely ridiculous report on the human rights of Venezuela. And he was there with 5 or 6 members of his government, trying to explain to them how human rights are central, not only to the Constitution, but to the actual functioning of the government of Venezuela. And that's a very important distinction. And he was very successful. The only 2 countries that voted against Venezuela were the United States and France, whose record in human rights I will not comment on, but we know that they are quite dreadful.
There are some differences between Simón Bolívar and President Chávez and his government, in the sense that there's a 200-year gap.
Yes.
And at the time, as you said, Simón Bolívar was heavily influenced by the French Enlightenment, and Rousseau and Montesquieu and all the Enlightenment writers and,
yes,
and their ideas on democracy and liberty. But at the time, Simón Bolívar didn't feel Latin America was ready for full-on democracy. So right now, like, Chávez has way more of a popular base, pluralistic democracy than there was back then. And that's not criticizing Simón Bolívar. It's been 200 years, and the Latin American people have developed more. Would you comment on that, please?
Well, of course, you are absolutely right. First of all, Simón Bolívar lived before Karl Marx. So he lived before socialism. And what the Bolivarian government is trying to create is a new type of socialism. Not a socialism based on Europe, not a socialism based on the Soviet Union, not even a socialism based on Cuba, but one which is sui generis, which is exclusively coming out of, first of all, the tradition of Latin American indigenous peoples, and of many of the thinkers of Latin America. And third of all, that is adopted to the kind of structures and values that Venezuela has. So yes, we can't say that Simón Bolívar was a socialist, because there was socialism in certain aspects of the indigenous peoples, but he was before Karl Marx. Also, you must remember what I mentioned. He was looking at a continent where I would say 80% of the people couldn't read or write, where they had been enslaved in the most vile forms and lived in great oppression. So you don't take a people like that and then all of a sudden say, hey, come in and have a perfect democracy. He knew quite well that this was happening. But with the President Chavez and his government, one of the things that they are trying to do is build this new socialism of the 21st century, which they believe is a humanist socialism. This is a socialism that accepts the cosmologies of its people. It is not materialistic determinism like Marx's is. It is one that accepts the cosmovision of its indigenous peoples and the cosmovision of most of its people, which is Christian, either Catholic or evangelist, most of them. And of course, there are pockets of Judaism and pockets of Islam. And so it says it is pluralistic. It is a socialism that will accept the plural cosmologies of its people, but not just accept that it is material communism like it was before. It accepts that there are different cultures in Venezuela. Now, this is really important, because before, no one used to say that. There was no government, no institution saying that Venezuela had different cultures. And the government of President Chavez, the first thing it has done is say, there are many cultures in Venezuela. First of all, the indigenous ones. There are 42 different indigenous tribes in Venezuela. They speak different languages. All those languages have been called official languages. The Constitution has been translated into these languages, and sometimes they have to invent how to write it because some of these languages had no written aspect of it. The Venezuelan government has accepted the different culture of the Afro-Venezuelans. These are people who are black, and they are the direct descendants of the black slaves, and they have preserved through all these years many, many, many aspects of their original culture. So all of these things are something that now the government has brought to light. Now, of course, the opposition says that all of this is racism, because racism didn't exist before Chavez. He's brought forward racism, which is, of course, absurd. It's just that these people lived there, but their cultures had never been recognized before.
It's the same in Bolivia now with Morales. He's actually given rights to the indigenous populations. The aristocracy elite there is now calling it, they feel like they're being discriminated against.
Yes.
But all he's done is actually given these people rights, and they just happen to have 60% of the population.
Yes.
So it's kind of ironic, contradictory.
It is. I was talking once, giving a talk here, and I was talking about all the indigenous rights that are now in the Constitution, that are now in institutions, the indigenous peoples that are now represented. You know, in municipal council, there's always 3 empty chairs. Those 3 empty chairs represent the indigenous peoples in areas where there are no indigenous peoples. So where there are no indigenous peoples, there have to be 3 chairs that are empty to remind people that they are there, even if we cannot see them or they're not in that area. So anyway, I'm talking about the amazing cultural, religious, language rights that now indigenous people say. And one person asked me a question. He said, but I was in Caracas just recently, And I saw a march of indigenous peoples walking through the streets protesting about something. And I said, wonderful. This is terrific to see the indigenous peoples out on the street and making demands for the things that they want, because who knows what their real needs are except themselves, right? And I said, if it had been the past governments, those indigenous peoples would never have dared walk down the streets of the capital to stop the traffic and to, make a demonstration for their rights. The police would have been called and they would be hit or even shot at. How dare these Indians come into the capital to talk about things that we don't care about? So, yes, there has been a new, I would say, enthusiasm and participation and creativity that is happening. And it all doesn't come from the government. It comes from people who feel empowered, communal councils, indigenous peoples, Afro-Venezuelans, women. All of these groups that before had no voice were invisible or were treated with tremendous paternalism by previous governments that all they did were governments run by elites for the elites. And so the opposition that President Chavez has now, people should ask, who are these people? And then ask them, where were these people when they were governing the country? Why is it that when they were governing the country, 80% of this oil-rich country was in absolute misery, in complete poverty, 80% of the people? Where were they? And I also asked the international community, where was the international community that now is so focused on Venezuela and human rights? Where were they when the previous government in 1989 killed 3,000 ordinary Venezuelans because they protested the International Monetary Fund forced Venezuela to pull up all the prices of everything. So people woke up one day, went to take the bus, and the bus cost 200 times what it cost the day before. When they went to buy a piece of bread, and the bread cost 300 times more what it cost the day before. And there was this spontaneous burst. The first ever rebellion against the International Monetary Fund occurred in Caracas at that time, and it's called the Caracazo. So when these people were killed by the army, who was brought out with their machine guns, and they fired even into the homes of the people in these little shanty towns, they didn't care who they killed. Where was the international community that's so worried about international human rights? Where were they when people were disappeared in Venezuela, when homes were being raided, when children were sent to prison because of their parents? All of these atrocious things. When there was torture in Venezuela, the Venezuelan CIA, the Venezuelan police, under the education of the CIA, invented the torture of throwing people off helicopters to kill them, and their bodies afterwards washed up. You know, why did I speak up? Because I know Venezuelan history. And Venezuelans, why are they with Chavez? Because they know their own history, and they can see how they lived before Chavez and how they live after Chavez. And I'm not saying the government is perfect. What government is perfect? Have they committed mistakes? Many mistakes. Have they eradicated all the problems of the country? Well, you don't drag a country out of misery and underdevelopment, not even in 10 or 12 years. Those are huge problems that the government has. You don't find agriculture like you build a factory out of bricks after you have destroyed agriculture for 40 years. So Venezuelans know their history, and they are judging this government precisely by saying, before we lived like this, and now we live like this, and now we have hope.
It's interesting what you're saying. Some of the criticism coming out of segments of the Western establishment, Western academia even, is that Chavez hasn't done enough with the oil revenues. To me, it's such a shallow argument because where he started was at the near bottom, with 80% in utter poverty.
I just wanted to say about academics. academics have an idea of what the socialism should be. And they've read all the great thinkers, Lenin and Marx and Engels and Gramsci and all of them combined. And so they have this ideal picture in their minds. That's not the picture that the sovereign Venezuelan people have. The Venezuelan people are sovereign, and they will create a type of socialism which they feel is the one that suits them. So they are not looking towards an ideal that is in some book, especially some European book. They are, again, judging according to their own history and creating something according to their own needs.
That's very interesting. What I'm wondering about is this humanistic ideology. Could you touch on the roots of it, like where it's coming from? Is it literally coming from the Latin American people, their souls, who they are as a people?
Absolutely. Latin American cultures are not materialistic. This is something that, again, academics don't like because of the normal Marxist kind of material determinism. But if you respect the cosmology of Latin Americans, you will see that Latin America is a profoundly spiritual continent. And in Venezuela, greatly spiritual. And its spirituality is mixed, because you will have people, and I have seen this many, many times, who will have in their own homes a little shrine, and they'll have a little picture of the Virgin Mary, and next to it they'll have a little figure of Simon Bolivar. And the prayers will be said to both of them. And also with a little figure perhaps of Maria Leonza, who is the queen of the jungle. Now all these things are kind of mixed. But the Christian ideology that has been most linked to the Venezuelan Bolivarian Revolution is that of liberation theology. And liberation theology is something quite extraordinarily unique to Latin America. We're talking about bishops and priests who believe that the real function of Christianity is to give an option to the poor. That if Jesus were here, he wouldn't be in the great parlors of the world and the great elites. He would be with the poor. And liberation theology believes that poverty itself is a social sin, that it behooves the Catholic person to try utmost to eradicate. But the poor themselves are holy. The poor themselves are close to God. So this is liberation theology, which of course has been attacked by the hierarchy of the Catholic Church and by the right-wingers, calling it, Marxism and such, but it recognizes that many of the things that Marxism has said are absolutely true, especially when it talks about the oppression of the poor and how they are maintained that way. So this is an important strain of the humanism of the Bolivarian Revolution. It also doesn't negate the cosmology of the indigenous peoples. It doesn't say to the indigenous peoples, oh, if you want to be in our revolution, you have to give up your culture. You have to give up your ideas of the other world or why we are here or all of these kind of things. No, incorporate it. Just like we can incorporate a picture of Simon Bolivar with the picture of the Virgin Mary. I don't want to be blasphemous. I myself am a practicing Catholic, but I'm just saying these are good things. These are things that urge people to be good. And that is one of the things that the humanism is of the Bolivarian Revolution. And also one of the most important things about the revolution is that this humanism means you have to be centered upon the human person so that the human person can really flourish and can all its creativity come out, but it not on an individual basis, but united with other people, because we are not solitary individuals. We only live in conjunction with others. So that humanism is also, I would say, underlined by solidarity. And that is very, very important because it is antithetical to the Bolivarian Revolution, the extreme individualism that we see in the rich countries.
It's very interesting. Well, the Venezuelan humanistic ideology is about individuals embracing all aspects of their life.
Yes.
And they also have a material component, but there's so many other aspects. But also it's from an interconnected standpoint.
Exactly.
But
That's
you know what's
exactly.
interesting is the U.S., Ayn Rand, are you familiar with Ayn Rand?
Yes.
Well, her philosophy is centered on the individual, and to me it's a completely erroneous philosophy because it lacks the interconnectedness of people, which cannot be denied.
It's also anti-scientific.
Yes.
You ask any anthropologist, you ask any sociologist. I mean, if she were right, we would all be lone wolves out in the jungle, living by ourselves, and you know that that's not possible.
Yet, ironically, the Americans have embraced that philosophy.
Yes, but it's very convenient to capitalism.
Yes.
Because what does capitalism do? Capitalism doesn't want trade unions. Capitalism doesn't want communal councils. Capitalism wants the consumer and believes that freedom is between the fact that you can go to a supermarket and choose between Rice Krispies and cornflakes. This is the reduction of the individual to its commercial use. And the Bolivarian Revolution rejects that. It rejects that extreme individualism. It embraces solidarity, but you can't be solidarity with other people unless you also embrace yourself as a human being. But more importantly, the humanism of the Bolivarian Revolution includes the environment. And this is something different because it says we are also in the same world with all these other species and with these trees and these rivers and everything that's around us. And if we destroy that, we will be destroying ourselves ultimately. So for the first time in Venezuela, for the very first time, there is not just amongst the elite or group of professional people in a ministry, but there is a movement where people are becoming more respectful and knowledgeable about nature and their role in nature. And when the development plans are given over to local authorities, such as the communal councils, these are people who live very close to nature. They depend upon the animals and the trees and everything, and so they are the ones who would be least interested in destroying that, I would say, ecosystem. Whereas if you come with a big corporation who comes in here and said, oh yes, we're going to build X, Y, or Z, they really don't care. They're thinking about what they're going to drag out of the earth and then sell in an international global market. So one of the important economic points of view of the Bolivarian Revolution is what they call endogenous development, endogenous economy, which says the first thing of an economy is to serve its people. So the first thing we have to do is serve the domestic internal market. Why are we, investing in an enormous monoculture to sell coffee or tea in the international market when we don't have the vegetables to feed people? So it's not that we're saying don't sell the coffee. We're saying don't put the cart before the horse. So the whole tenure of the agrarian reform, the whole tenure of what is called for the first time in Venezuela food security, is the most essential human need, which is feed your people. And this has been one of the important, I would say, pacts that were made between the countries. When the whole market crashed a year or so ago, the leaders of the UNASUR came together and said, what we must do is promise each other that there will be no famine in Latin America. This was an enormous step of Latin American countries saying, we're going to protect our people. They will not go hungry like it happens in Asia or Africa. We are going to help each other to feed our people, no matter if the international stock market crashes. This is absolutely revolutionary. And I just wish that, for example, Africa had that. So we are seeing Latin America, after 200 years, growing up and finding a new impetus, a new way of taking away the chains of a new type of colonialism and saying, We are going to direct the destiny of the continent. And let me repeat, it also includes the countries that may not be so left-wing as Venezuela, because it's the respect that they have of each other's sovereignty, such as Chile right now that has a right-wing government, and of course a country which are more in the middle, like Argentina and Brazil. And yet they are united, and they feel that they are working together, that they've got projects together, that they are making businesses together, but not just to obtain, goods for a company, but things that are going to help their countries develop. This is an extraordinary moment for Latin America. And in these moments where the whole world is talking about the financial crisis and the political crisis and the dollar crisis, etc., Latin America is the most exciting place right now. And it is a place that may not have solved all its problems, but it is absolutely full of hope.
At least in terms of its democracy, it's extremely progressive. The stuff President Morales in Bolivia is doing is almost off the charts.
Amazing, absolutely
yeah,
amazing.
It's absolutely amazing.
I didn't speak about him because you didn't ask me, but he is another of the great heroes of his people and of Latin America.
And unfortunately, the expatriates from Bolivia are very similar to the expatriates. I'm talking about the certain anti-Morales segment,
yes.
And they, similar to Venezuela, they had control over that country, and most of the population was in poverty, and now that they're getting rights, they're saying this isn't fair. Like, it just doesn't make sense. One thing, could you touch on this criticism? I've seen it on the internet, and I don't know who's putting it out, but they would say that Chavez has taken Simon Bolivar and what his accomplishments merely to prop up the Chavez government. It seems like such an ignorant statement based on what you said.
And I'm a sociologist, and I like facts. And I always ask those people, what were you doing? What were you doing when the country was immersed in 80% of poverty? And why do I support President Chavez? Yes, all the ideas are very, very nice, but I'm a sociologist. I'm a bit empirical, and I want to look at what he's actually accomplished. So we've got healthcare. We've got healthcare. We now have almost 90% of the people, 80% of the people have direct access to good, very good healthcare system. Education. Well, more than half of the people in the country, of 27 million, are studying something or other. The dropout rate of children from schools went from 70% to almost 95% now. Venezuela has reached the Millennium Goals of the United Nations. When you think of the oil that was a toy of these very same people who in Calgary go around slagging Venezuela, these people stole the petroleum of Venezuela and used it for their own purposes. And now oil money is being used for food security, for free education, public health care, for environmental protection. Where were they? What kind of environmental protection were they doing? This is what you want to ask them. What happens with the agrarian reform? Well, how come there were so many people who were landless before? Now they have not only a piece of land, but all the backing that they need, all the help from agriculturalists, all the help from obtaining the tractors and the things that they need, because they're urged to do it in cooperation, not individually, but in cooperation. How come now there are 50,000 cooperatives in Venezuela? What about the women? How come women who just worked at home were never recognized? That work was never recognized. And when they got old, they were out on the streets. I want to say something. When these people were governing, it was so common. You went to any town in Venezuela, you walked to any of these streets in Venezuela, and you'd see these half-clad little kids walking around almost barefoot. They weren't in school. They were hungry. They were out in the streets. You go to Venezuela now, and it's rare to see a child in the street. The other thing is you see poor children wearing glasses. Did these people not notice this? That when they were ruling, you rarely saw a poor child with glasses because they couldn't afford glasses. You rarely saw a poor person in a wheelchair because they couldn't afford a wheelchair. You go to Venezuela and you see people with their arms maybe in a proper sling, with their legs in a proper sling or proper crutches instead of, make-do pieces of wood. Now that shows you that something has happened within the country. These are little things, but important things. What about daycare? When was there daycare? Now we have simoncitos and people who have to work, leave their child in a daycare, that the children get proper care and they get warm breakfast and they get a warm lunch. These things didn't exist before. All of these things are things that have changed the life of ordinary people. And that's where you have to go to find out and be very empirical about it. And these people who are here talking badly of the country of their birth when they know nothing of what is going on are doing themselves a disservice, because it just shows the callousness of their governments previous to President Chavez. So quite frankly, you have to look at those things and look at the statistics. When you look at a country, one of the most important indicators of well-being is infant mortality. And in 1998, the infant mortality in Venezuela was 28 per thousand. Out of 1,000 live births, 28 children died before the age of 1. Now, that has been reduced to, I think it was, the last that I saw was 13 per thousand. Now, this is an enormous amount of people. These are thousands of babies that are alive. Venezuela now has an indicator of one of the countries where there is least malnutrition in the region. This is a country where a third of the population was malnourished. The extreme poverty was 21% in 1998, and that has been reduced to 7%. Now that's enormous, that in such a short time, a government, through active poverty programs, has been able to reduce these important indicators. So as I said, I am empirical. People want to say, why do you support Chavez? Well, I can talk to you about the ideas, which are very nice, but I can also talk to you about these important empirical indicators that show a very change of life for the people who are living in Venezuela.
Very interesting. In terms of the humanistic ideology, would you consider Venezuela to be a spiritual place as compared to Europe and North America, for example?
I think it is an extremely spiritual place. It is in all our cultures. When you go to Venezuela, it comes from the very nature of the country, of the mixture of the indigenous peoples, of the Spanish also, of the black Africans, and their traditions that have continued despite 500 years of oppression. Venezuelans look towards greater things and believe that what they are doing now has some effect in the afterlife, or in terms of good and evil. The materialism has never actually been something important in Latin America. It is a more European point of view. But when you look at the Bolivarian revolution, one of its greatness is that it has been able to say, fine, your own private belief is perfect. All we want you to do is bring your private belief and join us in trying to make this life right now better for the country, better for all your compatriots here, and better for the environment and the animals that live here with us. And so it is saying you don't have to give up your own private religions, your own private points of view. And it's a bit like that altar that I tell you that can have many different good people that they are looking towards.
Oh, that's really interesting. So in terms of Venezuela, what specifically would trump consumerism, materialism, would you say? Just to put it in concrete terms.
I think that one of the things that has been repeated over and over by the Bolivarians in Venezuela is, you are not just a consumer. This consumerism is part of the savage capitalism and savage individualism. That is not what we are about. What you should consume are the things that will make your life, according to your human dignity, the real needs of people, which are food and proper shelter and proper education and all of these things. These things we should spend on. That's why when they're criticizing the government as to, oh, you're throwing away the oil money, the government says, no, this is what the money is for. This is why we are using oil money, because we should spend it for that. What family says, oh, I had this gold hidden under my bed, but I'm not going to use it even though my children are running around naked. And so it's ridiculous. So, and this is really important for the environmental crisis that the world has right now, because the world of the North, the world of the rich, is absolutely sunk in this irrational consumism of consume and consume for frivolous things, for very individualistic things, whereas the countries of the South need to consume. They need to consume in order to bring their people out of misery. And unless the rich countries make their ecological footstep less, that is, unless the rich countries use less those resources of the earth, then the countries of the South will not be able even to reach a proper level to give a dignified life to their people. But it entails this. And why? Because the rich countries have an ecological debt to pay, because the development of the rich countries has reached this stage because they have pillaged and looted the countries of the South, because it has been through their colonialism first, and then the colonialism of these grand transnational corporations that are sucking up the resources that are needed, and these are mostly in the South, in order to feed this monster of consumerism that the North has. So that is an ecological debt that the rich countries have. So in Venezuela, the Bolivarian government has always fought against this superfluous consumerism and said, no, we have to produce in order to give you a dignified life, but not for frivolous things. And health isn't frivolous, and education isn't frivolous, and agrarian reform isn't frivolous.
So would you say, is it humanism which would trump consumerism?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's the term, isn't it?
Yes, and it will, because this humanism is submerged in solidarity.
Right.
Because we are solidarity with those that are also human with us, and also the earth and the animals that are in it. So it's this solidarity that is most important.
Yeah.
In order to be solidarity, you have to first of all recognize the human rights. And one of the human rights is the rights to a good and plentiful environment. And you can't have that unless you respect that right, unless you respect the rights of the environment. So it is a humanism, it is a solidarity, it is a respect of pluralism in terms of culture, in terms of religion. It is saying to the people, come, join us in this walk that we're going to walk together. We're not going to tell you to give up, your own personal beliefs. The only thing that we're going to ask you to give up is exclusion and racism and all those things that will go against the human rights. That we do ask people to give up. And it's a question of education also.
I think a good example for the viewers listening of what you're saying is the Venezuelan Constitution. I encourage people to take a look at that, because it definitely mirrors what Dr. Victor you're saying there. As far as I'm concerned, it's beautifully written, and the ideals are very worth striving for. Is there anything you would like to add in closing?
That ideals are very important. That if we are truly human, we truly have to strive for the better. We can't just say, oh, this is the way it is, or accept misery and oppression and the chains that bind us. So we must have hope, and we must have ideals. We must have some idea of where we want to go. We may not reach it, but at least we're going to try that road. And we live here in the North, we live in a very cynical world where people don't believe in politicians. Look at the latest election in Ontario, where we got 40% of the people voting. Whereas in Venezuela, you have about, 100% people voting. They at least believe that what they are doing is important, that they are going to be the drivers of their own destiny. There is no cynicism right now in Venezuela, or I would say Latin America. People are either for or against. It's true. There may be a lot of polarization, but not this cynicism. Cynicism is very insidious. Cynicism is throwing in the towel and thinking that we can't build a better world. Well, I just want to say a better world is being built right now in Venezuela and in most of Latin America.
Thank you very much. Just to comment on what you said there, in fairness to the people in European societies and North American, through the FDA electoral audits, a lot of these European governments and North American governments are extremely unfair. So it creates a lot of discontent and people not wanting to participate because they feel they don't really have a say, and the people running for government do not represent their voice.
The representative democracy is in a terrible state.
Exactly.
So that is just voting once in a while rather than people, citizens participating in political decisions.
So something has to give at some point, because I think there's good people in the North. They're just being silenced by the way the democracies have developed.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Victor.
Solidarity.
You too. Thank you very much for this presentation. I hope it sheds more light on Venezuela, and I personally find it quite inspiring what Venezuela is going through and the ideals and actually getting beyond consumerism.
Thank you very much for listening in to this episode of the Foundation for Democratic Advancement's podcast. For the FDA to continue to improve democratic processes worldwide, we rely upon your generous donations. To donate to the FDA, please visit our website at www.democracychange.org. To learn more about our mission, vision, and work, you can also visit us on Facebook